You asked about whether President Trump can end the war as he promises on day one, and the answer is yes. Now, it's going to be a lot, and because we control all the funding for the war. It's our war. It is not, it is a war that Ukraine did not need, that has been disastrous for Ukraine. And we're told lies about that war. We're told lies about the casualties. We're told lies that Ukraine is winning the war. Ukraine is losing the war catastrophically right now. And within a year, the military in Ukraine is likely to collapse. None of our press is being honest with us about this. They tell us that this kind of comic book narrative about that makes Putin a supervillain, and I'm not defending Vladimir Putin, and he had other choices but to invade. We need to understand, as the American people, our part in the provocations and our part in making this war a proxy war against Russia. And in fact, President Biden was very, very honest about this in April of 2022. When we forced Ukraine to walk away from a peace agreement that was very, very generous with Russia, that both sides had already initialed in Istanbul. And President Biden was asked, why are we going to war in Ukraine? And he said, we want regime change in Russia against Vladimir Putin. Well, that's not for Ukraine freedom. Lloyd Austin, as Secretary of Defense, was asked at that same time the same question, and he said, our purpose is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. That's nothing to do with Ukraine. And we're told this war began in February of 2022. It didn't. It began in February of 2014 when the CIA and USAID overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and a neutral government and put in power a pro-U.S. government. And the Russians had warned from the beginning, you can never put NATO into Ukraine. We had made a deal in 1992 when the walls came down, and they allowed us to reunify Germany, East and West Germany. They had marched out 450,000 Soviet troops and allowed NATO, a hostile army, to come into those barracks. And the one thing Gorbachev asked us at that time was that we would not move NATO any further to the east, and we promised we wouldn't. James Baker, the Secretary of State, famously said, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Since then, we've repeatedly broken our word. We've moved NATO 1,000 miles to the east through 14 countries, and the Russians said from the beginning, but you can't go into, we don't like what you're doing. We're appalled by it. It's dangerous. But whatever you do, you cannot move NATO into Ukraine. Why? Ukraine has a 2,200-mile border with Russia. It's like Canada and the United States. If we put Aegis missile systems, which we've done in Poland and Romania, these are Lockheed Tomahawk missiles that can be equipped with nuclear warheads. Those nuclear missiles would be 3.5 minutes from the Kremlin. We could decapitate the entire Russian leadership in 3.5 minutes with no time to respond, and that destabilized the whole world. Russia's been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. We have 0 strategic interest in Ukraine. We have no treaty with Ukraine. The Russians have an extreme strategic interest in Ukraine. We overthrew their government. Putin waited, tried to negotiate an agreement, the Minsk Accords, which France agreed to, France and Germany agreed to, and the Ukrainian government agreed to, and then we pressured Zelensky not to sign it. Zelensky ran in 2019 on a peace platform promising to sign the Minsk Accords, and he won with 70% of the vote because the Ukrainian people wanted peace. They didn't want a war. And when he got in there, we put pressure on him not to sign the agreement. And Russians ultimately went in February of 2022 with only 40,000 troops. They weren't trying to march across Europe as we were told in this country. They weren't, Putin wasn't Hitler bent on world conquest. That's what we were told. He sent only 40,000 troops into a country of 44 million people. Clearly, he did not want to conquer it. What he said clearly again and again, and we never listened to him, I just want you back at the peace table. Zelensky went to Biden and asked him to negotiate a peace. Biden refused. Zelensky then went to President Xi in Russia and asked him, and he refused. He then went to Naftali Bennett in Israel and to Erdogan in Turkey, and they said, we'll do it. And they negotiated a new peace agreement in Istanbul, in which the Russians agreed to leave Donbass and Lugansk, part of Ukraine, even though Donbass and Lugansk had voted overwhelmingly to go to Russia. Putin said, no, I don't want you. Let's settle this. And the only thing he wanted was our agreement not to put NATO in Ukraine, because he doesn't want missiles 3.5 minutes from the Kremlin. And we wouldn't either. My uncle almost went to war with Cuba in 1962 when they were going to put missiles 45 minutes from Washington. And my uncle settled that in a secret agreement. He realized that with Ambassador Dobrynin told my father, this was not unprovoked. We did this because you put nuclear missiles in Turkey on our border, so we want them on your border for equity. My uncle realized that was fair, and he told Khrushchev, we will remove them from Turkey if you take them out of Cuba. And that's how he settled it, because he was talking directly to Khrushchev. And we had peace. My uncle said, you have to understand your adversary if you're going to have peace in the world. And we have we do not listen to anything the Russians are telling us. And now and since April 2022, when President Biden, they signed that agreement, both sides, President Biden sent Boris Johnson to Kiev and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And that's when the war started. And since then, 600,000 Ukrainian kids have died for nothing. 300,000 Russians have died for nothing, and we should not applaud any of those deaths. It's not good for the world. It's not good for anything. And now we're talking about we encourage Ukraine to invade Russia. And the Russians were saying from the beginning, Putin was saying from the beginning, I'm scared if you go in there because I'm scared you'll use it as a base to invade Russia. Well, we did exactly what he said. Now we're going to allow Storm Shadow missiles, which are operated with U.S. satellite technology, to hit the Kremlin, hit targets in Russia. 2 weeks. They say we're going to do that. Putin has said, if you do it, we are at war with NATO and with the United States of America. This is World War III. As Tulsi said, the Russians have 1,200 more nuclear warheads than we do. They're the greatest nuclear power in the world. They have better missile systems than we do. They have electronic warfare that is a generation ahead of us. We are operating on a delusional basis, thinking we can win this war. They have hypersonic missiles, which the Chinese do too, and we don't. That can sink every ship in the U.S. Navy because they can't be defended against. I read a Pentagon report last night about their electromagnetic pulse weapons that can make all of our nuclear weapons useless. We don't have that, as far as we know. The Russians do. The Russians have technology. We have shown them all of our best weapon systems, and they have deconstructed them, and they know how to defend against them because we put them in the hands of a second-class army, which has allowed the Russians to capture those and to understand them and understand their defense. We've lost all of our surprise advantages. We've pushed Russia into alliance with China. Russia now has rebuilt its industrial base. It's rebuilt its economy because the U.S. sanctions forced them to build an independent parallel economy, and they've done it successfully. They have almost zero inflation. They have, compared to us, virtually zero national debt. Putin is at the height of his popularity. We have forced Russia into this very deadly alliance with China and Iran. China has the greatest industrial base in the world. We exported, the Democratic Party exported our industrial base to China. We won World War II. We still think we're in World War II. We won World War II because we had an industrial base in this country. We were making steel and ball bearings and automobiles. We became the arsenal of democracy because we repurposed those to build 56,000 airplanes a year, fighter jets a year, fighter airplanes, a ship a day. We can't do that anymore. The Chinese can. The next war is going to be fought with drones and hypersonic missiles, which they have and we don't. China has many companies, 100 companies that make drones. Just one of those companies makes 76% of the drones on Earth. We can't fight them, and we're collapsed economically in this country. China's the greatest economy in the world. Russia's economy is booming. They're now allies for the first time in history with Iran. And the people in this White House are delusional. The United States is the only country in the world that wants war. Nobody else does. And we need to start understanding the facts and talking about them publicly. And the United States mainstream media will not tell you any of the truths that I just told you about what's really happening. And we're sleepwalking into World War III.